With the launch of the Ryzen 3000 series processors, we've noticed a distinct confusion among viewers when it comes to the phrases Precision Boost 2, XFR, Precision Boost Overdrive, which is different from Precision Boost and Precision Boost 2, and AutoOC. There's a lot of confusion about what's considered stock, what PBO even does, or if it works at all, or if it's been oversold as a feature by AMD, and how thermals impact frequency of Ryzen CPUs. Today, we're demystifying these names and demonstrating the basic behaviors of each solution as tested on 2 different motherboards. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and the Gamers Nexus Toolkit on store.gamersnexus.net. Our brand new toolkit just launched and contains 10 custom-made drivers for video card disassembly, repasting, and teardowns. The 8 core tools are made of high-quality chromium vanadium alloy steel that's built for long service life and resistance to wear during use. The other 2 tools are carbon steel hex heads that were custom ground down for capacitor clearance on video cards. All the tools are easily mounted to a pegboard or stored in the GN-made tool bag for easy transport. Learn more at the link in the description below. Precision Boost Overdrive is a new technology to the Ryzen family of desktop processors, having first been introduced on the Threadripper SKUs previously, and technically Ryzen 3000 already uses something called Precision Boost 2. PBO, with the overdrive in there, is explicitly different from Precision Boost and Precision Boost 2. Adding the overdrive is an important change. This is where a lot of the confusion comes about. So Precision Boost is not a shorthand for Precision Boost Overdrive. Just to be very clear there, it's a different thing. Precision Boost is kind of like XFR. AMD has this extended frequency range boosting table for boosting a set number of cores a little bit higher under limited thread workloads. This is something introduced on Ryzen 1000 series, and XFR has more or less been rolled into Precision Boost 2 at this point in its entirety. So XFR was introduced a while ago, and Precision Boost takes into account 3 numbers when deciding how the boosting behavior should perform. And it's looking at how many cores should boost, when should they boost, and under what conditions, and then how high can they boost. So the numbers that are taken into consideration are PBT, TDC, and EDC, and we'll define each of those. There's also temperature and the chip's maximum boost clock. Precision Boost is enabled on a stock CPU. So Precision Boost, not Precision Boost Overdrive, to be really clear here. Again, Precision Boost is considered stock. Precision Boost Overdrive is not considered stock, and this is something that AMD states as well. So what PBO does not ever do is boost the frequency beyond the advertised CPU maximum frequency. So if the advertised frequency boost is 4.6, which does not mean all core, by the way, it means limited thread, like 1 core scenarios, then PBO isn't going to get you to 4.7 or anything like that. So that's another point to demystify here. We'll quote directly from AMD's review guide just to firmly define what PPT, TDC, and EDC are, and then we'll go through some additional explanations and a whole lot of testing we've done to try and see if these features even work properly. Package power tracking is PPT. The PPT threshold is the allowed socket power consumption permitted across the voltage rail supplying the socket. This is again a quote from the AMD review guide. Applications with high thread counts and/or heavy threads can encounter PPT limits that can be alleviated with a raised PPT limit. Default for socket AM4 is at least 142 watts on motherboards rated for 105 watt TDP processors. Default for socket AM4 is at least 88 watts on motherboards rated for 65 watt TDP processors. Thermal design current, or TDC, is next. The maximum current in amps that can be delivered by a specific motherboard's voltage regulator configuration in thermally constrained scenarios is what AMD defines as thermal design current. Default for socket AM4 is at least 95 amps on motherboards rated for 105 watt TDP processors. Default for socket AM4 is at least 60 amps on motherboards rated for 65 watt TDP processors. Electrical design current is EDC. This is the maximum current in amps that can be delivered by a specific motherboard's voltage regulator configuration in a peak or spike condition for a short period of time. Default is 140 amps on motherboards rated for 105 watt TDP processors and 90 amps for motherboards rated for 65 watt TDP processors. Knowing all of this, there's a few important things to cover next. First of all, this is the explanation of why TDP doesn't equal power consumption. So when you see 140 watts down EPS 12 volt rails to a 3900X and it not matching 105 watts, that's why. TDP doesn't equal power consumption necessarily. Next up, PBO only affects these 3 power limits. That's what it does. So the effect on CPU clock speed is indirect. AutoOC is a different feature, by the way. It's not bundled into PBO. That is a separate thing entirely, but it is contained within the menu. PBO will never boost, again, the CPU past the advertised clocks. At best, it will allow the CPU to maintain its boost clocks for potentially a longer period of time. And that's particularly going to be noticeable or have the strongest effect in scenarios where the CPU can already boost. So limited core scenarios would be the best way to demonstrate when PBO comes into play, if it does, depending on the motherboard you're working with. Because one of the constraints is thermal, it gets a little tricky to test, and PBO will also have less effect on CPUs that are already well cooled and are not bumping against the thermal limit. So if you have a high-end cooling solution on your CPU, PBO will, in theory, have less of an impact, and this is something we'll explore today as well. Remember that in addition to these 3 power limits, precision boost is constrained, again, by temperature and maximum boost clocks of the CPU as defined by the spec on the box. These limits are not affected by PBO. Those last 2 sentences might sound contradictory on the surface of it, so we need to further clarify and define a couple of additional parts of PBO and the PBO menu. PBO will raise the amount of power that is deliverable to the CPU when it's too hot, but it will not raise the temperature that the CPU considers to be too hot. So those are 2 different things. And further, platform thermal throttle limit is the temperature at which you would encounter issues. Just like with Intel, you can boost TJ Max in some of the BIOS options. So platform thermal throttle limit is not part of PBO. That has to be clarified as well. PBO has 3 options in it that are part of PBO, and then the PBO menu has additional options which are not part of PBO. And this is all defined very clearly in AMD's own documentation. So that's largely how we know what's part of PBO and what technically isn't, but it's still a feature. So thermal throttle limit is still a feature. It's not a PBO feature. When we did our initial reviews for the 3600 and 3900X, we had some frequency over time plots, and we can just let those run now for a moment. AMD has been extremely reluctant to commit to numbers from single core boosting and all core boosting because precision boost uses what is called an opportunistic algorithm to boost frequency until it hits one of these limits. AMD says the following of this, quote, "At the limit, the processor will draw back on boost and dither the frequency until the situation changes. This dithering and analysis loop occurs every 1 millisecond within Infinity Fabric's command and control faculties." And they further say, quote, "The processor is designed to use thermal headroom to drive higher average frequencies and thus more performance." There's 2 ways to look at this, and it's sort of the same line as GPU Boost 4.0. So the optimistic way to look at this is that AMD is out of the box automatically pushing the CPU to more or less where it can maximally stay stable. And that's why you see all-core overclocking lose some of its efficacy for this generation when it was already not particularly effective in 2000 series. It is less effective here. And in 1000 series, all-core overclocking was actually pretty useful. So that's one way to look at it. This is more efficient than manual overclocking. Efficient being a key word here. You can get higher with manual overclocking still in some instances, not all, but more efficient certainly in terms of a power to performance output. It's also more sensitive than manual overclocking. And then the pessimistic way to look at it is that it's another variable out of control of the user in some ways until you disable the features. And that makes it difficult to do testing or benchmarking, which is not particularly a valid user environment, so we don't really factor that in much into reviews, but it's something that people need to be aware of when they're doing comparisons of their own product or processor they've installed versus data they've seen online. And it is, again, sort of like GPU Boost 4.0 on NVIDIA, where the clock is boosting contingent upon a few different parameters, primarily power or current and voltage as, creating power, volts times amps equals watts, and then temperature. So those are the key ones for NVIDIA GPU Boost 4.0, and some of those factors are starting to apply to processors these days. It's not like where it used to be with Intel CPUs, for example, where until you hit TJ Max, you're fine, you're running at spec, and that's all there is to it. So very different in that regard. We're careful to use the same high-quality NZXT X62 liquid cooler for all of our testing. That's part of our standardized test benches. And We test with the fans and the pumps at max speed to avoid throttling. This is all done on purpose to eliminate a potential variable. You don't obviously want a CPU to throttle when you're trying to compare them all head to head in a like for like fair scenario. So that's what we use for our standard testing. We've added another one for some of the tests today using a lower spec AMD cooler on a high spec AMD processor. We'll talk about that later. And if we weren't using this high-end liquid cooler, then performance would be directly affected on Ryzen 3000 by using a lower quality cooler that can't keep the thermals at a lower temperature. So this isn't just under TJ Maxx now, it needs to be under, it's done in steps and increments where the frequency will boost depending on how high the temperature is. Again, GPU Boost 4.0 as an example boosts about every 5 degrees Celsius. So a few things here. All this, first of all, further reinforces our opinions on cases and choosing ones that have good thermals. So you can go check out our back catalog of case reviews now because it's definitely relevant here. Another one is the performance that a reviewer sees on a good cooler might not match what you see in a thermally constrained environment. And that's all just part of Precision Boost too, the feature, because it's thermally dependent again. So Precision Boost Overdrive, emphasis on the overdrive, is what AMD is calling when these three thresholds are bumped up. The default setting for PBO is auto, which the stock configuration specifies is disabled. So auto should mean off if everyone's following spec. Further, AMD's own review guide states to disable PBO for reviews. Again, emphasis on the overdrive. Overdrive is not spec. That's what we did for our review. It's what most people did for their reviews, if not all. And it's just how we disable MCE for Intel. The default numbers can be pulled from the chip with overdrive disabled for the three limiting numbers, or the higher numbers can be pulled from the motherboard with overdrive enabled, allowing you to bypass some of those limitations. Setting overdrive to enabled or setting overdrive to advanced and specifying the motherboard as the source did the same thing on the two boards we tested for this content, the Gallick and the X570 Master, but the two motherboards set different values. On the Gigabyte X570 Master with the 3900X, PBO limits were as follows. PPT was 1200 watts, TDC was 540 amps, and EDC was 600 amps. On the MSI Godlike, the limits were set to 1000 watts, 490 amps, and 630 amps. But at the end of the day, all it really means is they're functionally disabled at this point. They're so high that you're not going to hit those limits. With PBO disabled, the limits were PPT 142 watts, TDC 95 amps, and EDC 140 amps on both motherboards, which is the correct AMD specification for 105 watt TDP processors. The limits adjusted downwards to spec when a 65 watt processor was installed with PBO still disabled. It sounds like motherboard manufacturers are free to set higher numbers based on what they expect their own boards and VRM to be capable of, although some of the motherboard makers we spoke to are under the impression that AMD is supposed to help provide these numbers. So that's another issue entirely, and it's a teething issue. Because the limits change based on the processor used, 105 watt versus 65 watt, for example, this means that the advantages of PBO are dependent on things like the motherboard model, specifically the processor model, the specific processor, not the SKU, but the individual unit, the cooling solution, the temperature of the room, and the alignment of the planets. That brings us to a couple of other things, like AutoOC. So the 200 megahertz offset that's been mentioned a lot in conjunction with PBO is called AutoOC. It's a separate AMD feature. It's not technically part of PBO, but it is part of the PBO menu in BIOS. So AMD's put it in the same menu. It is not, however, a part of PBO. So it's a bit confusing the way BIOS is laid out, but that's how the spec explicitly defines it. PBO sounds good. It is good in a lot of ways. This allows users to circumvent some of the touchy GPU-esque clock behaviors that are starting to emerge on CPUs these days, and that's great, especially for users who have the VRM and cooling solutions they need to handle those higher speeds, to bypass potential power and other limits that we've gone over. And so on paper, it sounds like a great way to get rid of the vastly diminishing returns from all-core overclocks over the past generation of AMD processors and give overclockers access to a little performance via a different overclocking option. AMD intends PBO and AutoOC to be used in conjunction with each other, with AutoOC more useful in theory for single core boosting and PBO mostly benefiting the heavier core workloads where you're saturating more of them and challenging that power limit. But the thing is, in our testing, none of this helps. at least not much, and certainly not for us. Further, note that entering the number 200 does not mean it will actually offset by 200. It's more of a, you can offset within this limit. And in that regard, again, we look back at GPU clocks where you set an offset. It doesn't mean it's going to actually offset by that number because the base will change. So the base from which you are offsetting is variable, and the actual offset is not necessarily equal to the 200 number you might enter into AutoOC. We have a table from AMD that helps illustrate the intended use. AMD's reviewer guide says that the offset only applies to the max boost clock, but a chart later on clarifies that this is the max boost clock for any number of cores. The Ryzen 9 3900X has a max listed boost clock of 4.6 GHz. It may or may not ever hit this clock speed depending on the CPU itself and the usage, and probably not on more than one core. With AutoOC, this theoretical limit is raised to 4.8 GHz, but there's still no guarantee the chip will ever hit that. From AMD, quote, "This feature will not guarantee the higher boost clock on any number of cores. The frequency, cores, boost duration will still depend on the firmware managed limits, even though those limits are higher than OEM when PBO has been enabled." By this direction, enabling PBO and the offset make it more likely that the 3900X will maybe hit 4.8 GHz on one core once in a while in Cinebench single-threaded benchmarks, and sometimes in extremely heavy all-core loads, the CPU will run a little faster than it would with stock PPT, TDC, or EDC limits, although the all-core load is barely affected by the 200 MHz AutoOC offset in our testing, and spoiler alert there, we'll get to that. Once we had a handle on what PBO and AutoOC are supposed to do, we started testing. We began with an R5 3600 on the Gigabyte Aorus Master used for our Ryzen 3000 reviews, and the MSI Godlike, reasoning that the most power-hungry sample chip we had with the lowest stock clocks would benefit the most from removing current limitations. This is the CPU that took more than 1.4 volts, as a reminder, to complete our tests at 4.3 GHz all-core, when the 3900X could manage the same at 1.35. It's also the model of CPU that AMD showed gaining the most points in single-threaded performance with PBO and AutoOC. We have charts of that from their own reviewer's guide as well. Note that we're talking stock numbers with PBO as the A-B test here, so all core OCs are not part of this, just a reference point. MSI has another menu, in addition to the generic AMD PBO submenu, with some basic preset PBO profiles in it. We verified that all these profiles do is set PBO to advanced mode and max all the settings, except AutoOC, which again is technically a separate feature. Someone at MSI was paying attention to PBO enough to create these profiles, so we can assume that they've tailored the motherboard PBT, TDC, and EDC limits to fit their boards. In the interest of not making this piece 10 hours long, we'll summarize the tests we ran and discuss all the results together. We tested the R5 3600 and R9 3900X in the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master and MSI X570 Godlike motherboards, and we ran them with PBO disabled. We also tested PBO enabled to auto, PBO maxed with a plus 200 MHz AutoOC offset, including maxing thermal throttle limit and PBO scalar menu options. We also tried them minimized. We found that manually maxing the PBO variables and allowing the motherboard to set them accomplished functionally the same thing. So for, quote, max tests, we used the motherboard values. We ran a mix of Cinebench R15, R20, and 1080p game tests. We didn't run all tests on all configurations because it would have been a waste of time. The tests in the charts are the tests that we ran. We also ran two further passes on the 3900X and the Godlike board with the CLC fan and pump speeds manually slowed. We tested with PBO on and off to see whether Overdrive is more helpful when the CPU is warmer by, again, slowing down the CPU fan speed on the CLC to a point where it was running close to 85, 90 degrees, somewhere in that range. On the X570 Master with the R5 3600 and PBO disabled, Cinebench R20 scored 3759 multi-threaded, 484 single-threaded. Simply setting PBO to enabled scored 3748 and 485, and setting PBO to motherboard limits, functionally the same as max, maxing the throttle temperature and PBO scalar, and applying the AutoOC 200 MHz offset, scored 3765 and 496. That's a 0.2% improvement over stock for the multi-threaded score, absolutely within range of variance, and a 2.5% improvement in single-core performance. AMD showed a 21-point increase for one-threaded performance in this test. We showed a 12-point increase in ours, and we can't tell you the percent difference for AMD's numbers because they omitted a vertical axis on their marketing charts, attempting to render them as useless as possible. Cinebench R20 single-threaded on the R5 3600 is AMD's absolute best case scenario for PBO and AutoOC, and it barely does anything in their own testing. If their stock single-core score somehow exactly matched ours, and it should be very close, AMD's 21 points would be a 4.3% increase. On the Godlike board, we saw a 3.5% increase from PBO disabled to PBO max with AutoOC. We also ran Cinebench R15, so let's take a look at the R9 3900X for that benchmark. The lowest single-threaded score we saw was with PBO and AutoOC on the ORS board, and this is where our next big hurdle started to become visible. Precision Boost is so reactive that the variance between test results from one day to the next can be larger than the difference between OC and stock, or stock and PBO. For a more logical comparison, the Godlike improved 2.5%, moving from PBO off to PBO maxed with 200 MHz AutoOC, but then zero single-threaded improvement. We didn't bother running more synthetics than Cinebench for this content piece because PBO is supposed to be primarily beneficial to gaming, and because run-to-run variance with Precision Boost alone was starting to drive us insane. Also, this is the one AMD used anyway to demonstrate it. We demonstrated why Precision Boost was driving us crazy in our live stream. It's not a bad thing ultimately, and we'll talk about that at the end, but from a testing standpoint, it's difficult. We'll work on another content piece separately to really drive it home too. Basically, every couple degrees change in CPU temperature will affect frequency in a measurable way for results. And so the order of the tests completed will impact results, the pause between the tests will impact it, the room temperature, and more. We control all of these things as best we can, especially room temperature, but it's still a tough fight. These things are sensitive. This is partly a good thing from the standpoint of improving the CPU's performance, but again, difficult for tiny testing differences. AMD doesn't guarantee AutoOC will actually increase the clocks, and PBO's effect is inconsistent at best. Stick around for the end of this piece where we dig into Precision Boost behavior at sub-zero temperatures for some explanation of why. For game testing, we felt things out first by testing with Civilization 6, a consistent benchmark that should benefit from frequency increases across a limited number of threads. On the 3900X, turn time completions were almost exactly the same regardless of the cooler or if PBO or AutoOC was enabled. All of the 3900X results were gathered on the Gigabyte board. The test with the CLC and PBO disabled may have been marginally better with the air cooler, but a 1.2% reduction in turn time isn't concrete. Results for the 3600 on the MSI board with PBO and AutoOC on and off were identical, and the results on the Gigabyte board were so close to each other that they may as well have been. We have a more limited set of results for Total War Warhammer 2's battle benchmark, just the 3900X on the MSI board with an air cooler and a liquid cooler. For once, the results somehow lined up in a sane and reasonable fashion, with the 2 PBO and AutoOC enabled tests at the top and the 2 stock tests at the bottom, with the best result from the CLC and the worst result from an air cooler. There's a 2.6% improvement between the worst result and the best result. Patrick, who wrote most of this script, noted that he hopes everyone can appreciate the amount of time and effort he put into testing a feature that nobody understands and that barely does anything. And the nobody understands part is definitely true based on our live stream where most people think PBO is the same as Precision Boost, and this is not the fault of the viewers. It's the fault of AMD for choosing these names. The campaign benchmark also showed some scaling on each of the board and cooler combinations. The improvement from PBO off to PBO AutoOC on with the 3900X and a CLC on the MSI board was a whopping 2.4% and 1.5% on air. Despite being a lightly threaded workload, it doesn't seem that the Total War benefits are massive from the 200 MHz offset. But then again, nothing else has been either. It's pretty small, if measurable. In some of the instances, it's not. The 3600 scaled 1.6% with PBO and AutoOC enabled on the Gigabyte board. We would normally avoid such a patchy mix of hardware and tests, but we've been trying to cast as wide a net as possible to find any situation in which PBO and AutoOC provide a genuine advantage. Shadow of the Tomb Raider showed no significant change based on PBO or AutoOC on the MSI board with a 3900X air cooler, or not even, or on the Gigabyte board with the 3600. It's hard to get results this unchanging when we actually want them. Again, the GTA results for the 3900X were almost the same, all of them, regardless of context. The result with an air cooler and PBO and AutoOC enabled was very slightly worse than the other 3, presumably because of minor temperature fluctuations from repeated loads in rapid succession, or from a reasonable plus or minus 1 degree Celsius change in room temperature as the testing environment fluctuated. But it's still a difference of barely more than 1 FPS from the top result, which was achieved with PBO and AutoOC disabled. The R5 3600 on the Gigabyte board also scored 2 results within margin of error. The worst result for the 3900X in F1 2018 was with the air cooler and PBO and AutoOC enabled. The best result was with a CLC and PBO turned off. Our initial theory that PBO would help get around thermal constraints has not panned out, illustrated here. The difference is still a minuscule 1.1% gain between the worst and best results, however, so it's kind of a wash. It's hard to tell when the difference is real versus not. With a 3600 on the Gigabyte board, there's also less than a 1% increase between the two scores. Our final gaming benchmark was Hitman 2, DX12. The best result achieved for the 3900X was with PBO and AutoOC under a CLC, or closed loop liquid cooler, and the worst result was with an air cooler and PBO disabled. But the gap is still so incredibly small. It's even smaller with the 3600 on the Gigabyte board. We've failed to find a single game where enabling PBO and AutoOC made a significant difference, and PBO plus AutoOC is intended to improve gaming performance. AMD's marketing video says that. We'll cut to the clip itself.
Which allows, potentially, the CPU to run at a higher clock speed for a longer period of time. And more clock speed for longer means more performance, especially in games. They just love extra clock speed.
So the clip literally says, more clock speed for longer means more performance, especially in games. They just love that extra clock speed. We could test more combinations of boards and chips, but it just isn't happening without completely changing the definition of PBO. The power delivery capabilities of the boards we tested is high. The Ryzen Master software reports that the 3900X and 3600 both fall well below the motherboard-defined PBO limits, and motherboard manufacturers could triple PBO limits tomorrow if they're even the ones who control those numbers. Some of them are confused on if that's true, and it still wouldn't make a difference based on what we've seen. For the final charts, we'd like to show some of the differences in power and frequency behavior with PBO on and off. We did a lot of logging here, but we picked 2 runs as representative from the 3900X and the Gallick board, one with PBO disabled completely, and one with PBO enabled and set to the motherboard limits with a 200 MHz AutoOC. We started hardware info logging and put a current clamp around the CPU EPS 12 volt connectors and ran a Cinebench R15 run. First multi-threaded, then single-threaded in the same log file as you can see on the screen. For these results, we scored 514 and 7078 for one thread and multi-thread, and PBO off we had 520 and 7235 with PBO and AutoOC on. So you can see the clocks, but we've scored better with this chip and board with PBO disabled, and there's still only a 1.2% improvement at one thread and 2.2% improvement multi-threaded, but if any pass of any test is going to show a difference in frequency, this is it. We're showing the peak core clock here because that's the boost clock, which PBO and AutoOC are supposed to explicitly benefit, and because the average core clocks are even closer to identical. During the multi-threaded load at the beginning, PBO and AutoOC maintains a 50 MHz average, but during the single-threaded test, any difference is imperceptible, although the higher result with PBO and AutoOC on indicates there must be some delta. Averaging the peak frequencies during the single-threaded runs comes out to roughly 4514.4 MHz with PBO off and 4519.5 MHz with PBO and AutoOC on. vCore, as reported by Hardware Info, had a more obvious delta during the multi-threaded test, holding a 1.24 volt average for PBO off and 1.3 volt average for PBO and AutoOC. The single-threaded test again shows barely any difference, and in fact, taking an average has PBO disabled ahead of the other results at 1.47 versus 1.46, but that difference is negligible and is noise. Our preferred method for logging power is with the current clamp. With PBO disabled, we logged 11.6 amps multi-threaded, 3.3 single-threaded, or 139.2 watts and 39.6 watts, and with PBO and AutoOC maxed, we logged between 13.9 amps and 14.2 amps multi-threaded and 3.4 amps single-threaded, or 170.4 and 40.8 watts. The multi-threaded amperage actually spiked to 14.8 at the beginning, but dropped as low as 13.9 during the fairly brief run, which was corroborated by Hardware Info's power numbers. By this point in testing, we had seen so much variance in clocks and scores that we knew Precision Boost was affecting our results. We have liquid nitrogen on hand, so it was easy for us to just dump some of it onto the 3900X and see what it would do under absolutely ideal conditions, stock or with PBO. We'll expand on this more in a separate piece, but for now we can say that Cinebench R15, running with T-die at about 62 degrees Celsius, scored 3163 points, and that score scaled all the way up to 3427 points followed by a blue screen at minus 56 degrees Celsius for the score, and then blue screen at about minus 70 or so, depending. And similar, more stable scores were achieved at minus 30 C for the record. These were just some rough tests to see if PB would continue scaling clocks with temperature down to sub-zero, and it did. That's just precision boost, not overdrive. Nothing else was changed. No overclocking was done. Overdrive was not enabled. We just made it colder and ran it stock. We were maintaining up to nearly 4.4 gigahertz all-core in Cinebench completely stock, PBO disabled, higher than the highest all-core overclock we could achieve with a 280 CLC, and all without voiding the warranty. Precision Boost Overdrive voids your CPU warranty, not that they can check that. But dumping LN2 onto it and leaving it stock technically doesn't void the warranty. In fact, enabling PBO and 200 MHz AutoOC locked us to a maximum 4.2 GHz all-core and 4.25 with AutoOC disabled. This could be down to gigabyte at this point, but we did test MSI for the other benchmarks you saw earlier. So we still need to replicate this behavior on the other boards. It's bizarre either way. We're never seeing the 200 MHz boost from AutoOC. Especially in light of the LN2 results we've gathered so far, it seems like PBO is largely pointless. The limits that it's raising aren't the limits that we're encountering. The limit that's far, far more important is temperature, to the extent that for the CPU, for once, buying a closed-off case versus an actually good airflow case will be the difference in clock speeds. And not to give away the whole future content piece, but as we showed in the stream, if you run at, say, 78 degrees Celsius, which is not unreasonable, on a 3900X, you're looking at maybe 40-50 megahertz average. And 72, you're looking at 40-75 megahertz average. You come all the way down to something like 55 degrees Celsius, and now you're adding 200 megahertz to the average core clock with PBO disabled, just running Precision Boost 2, which are different things again. So yeah, PBO doesn't seem to do a whole lot here, if anything. And yeah, this, even at the Wraith Spire that isn't rated for the 3900X temperatures that we forcefully ran, we used a worse cooler than it comes with just to force a bad environment. PBO didn't make a significant difference. So we'll work on nailing down which settings are restricting the clocks to 4.2 on that Gigabyte board. But even with the MSI board, we're not really seeing anything. And we can't make wide sweeping statements saying that PBO is broken or anything like that, because maybe it's working as intended, or maybe some of the boards it works on, but not on others. We haven't looked at ASRock, for example, haven't looked at ASUS yet. But for these two boards, which do represent a large part of the market, it appears to do nothing. And our understanding is that this behavior should largely stem to the other boards too, because AMD provides the bulk of this code. So regardless of the verdict, we still haven't discovered a single scenario in which PBO makes a significant impact to performance. We also have to include the caveat that we don't think Ryzen 3000 processors are bad. Unfortunately, some of the people who watch this will not have seen our other videos, or because people have really short memory when it comes to being enraged on the internet, will have forgotten them, and will think that because we're saying PBO isn't really worth playing around with and doesn't seem to do much, that somehow translates into us saying that the Ryzen processors are bad. So there was some marketing here that was not good, and the feature doesn't seem to do what we expect or what we've been led to believe it does. But the processors on the whole are still good. We're still recommending buying the 3600, but unfortunately we have to include these notes because of how people just kind of read comments these days and not actually watch the content. But anyway, Precision Boost is from a reviewer standpoint, it's a finicky pain. That's PB, not PBO. And that's because it's harder to control for, just like GPUs are harder to control for. So from a reviewer standpoint, everyone needs to be very careful about things like the environment temperature, and we control it hard. I mean, our AC bill is going to be insane this month because we were running at the same rough 21, 22 degrees Celsius setting for all of the tests. But even that, with that control, you're still looking at potential for differences depending on what order you ran the tests in and how long the CPU's been under load. So that's something reviewers need to pay attention to. From a consumer standpoint, it's probably a good thing because you're effectively maxing out what the CPU can do without any effort. And so from a consumer standpoint, always, unfortunately, except for enthusiasts, removing the ability to overclock by way of providing all the performance out of box, it's kind of hard to argue against that unless you're an enthusiast. So Anyway, what we can say definitively is that Precision Boost and Precision Boost Overdrive and AutoOC are horribly named features. They're very poorly explained, even by AMD's official videos, and they barely do anything in terms of the naming other than serve to confuse the discussion. So in the stream was the best example because every 15, 20 minutes, I had to correct people who were saying he's using PBO right now. No, we were just using Precision Boost. They're different. It's not the same. So that's not the consumer's fault. It's AMD's fault for naming them confusingly. So anyway, that's our deep dive on Precision Boost. Patrick spent several days on this, and there's a lot more we could do yet, but we got to call it here. So there's more we could do with different boards, going to older boards, things like that, seeing where it works. But that'll wrap it for now. So now you know what Precision Boost is supposed to do and what it does or doesn't do. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, like by picking up one of our toolkits, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out there as well. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.